One of the things that I've been thinking about is how and why we even make more visuals in this current pandemic crisis, and how might we use other senses in the making of the visual. So certainly the visual isn't just about the making of new image vocabulary, but I keep thinking, what would new images of these crises be, and what would they be for? I want to think about how we might need to engage again with the digital image in terms of how it might function for sociology, and specifically visual sociology, in an age where we're kind of locked down, we may not be able to go outside. Who and why do we speak for or with or alongside as we make images? And how do we animate them? How do they performed? How are they enunciated or enacted? Where do they go to? And these problems of kind of construction, intervention, distribution seem to me absolutely urgent if we're thinking about images of the future. So how we engage future images. So what I want to do is suggest that one of the issues for us right now is that some images, and this is not a particularly new issue for sociology, some of the images we get as sociologists when we're doing research projects can't, for various reasons, be reproduced in their original form. So what do? What I want to do is present some visual material, both which has been created as part of a project where we were looking at trying to create new visual materials that act both as evidence and a device to become more proximate to an image that might otherwise not be seen. I'll just explain what I mean. So the history of sociology relies on a documentary image often, and may come from ethnographers who embed themselves into situations and scenes of the social, and with that becomes relationships of trust, anonymity, publicity, and so on. But 2 weeks ago, one of our colleagues here in the sociology department at Goldsmiths challenged us, a group of visual sociologists, to enable her to better think about some of the visual representations of her research. And I was reminded how this model might not always work for every project, this documentary, strictly documentary approach. So, as I said, this is about the future of the image, where the image itself may only appear initially as a sound, or in our case, a verbal description. Our colleague, Yasmin Gunaratnam, has been gathering information about the provision of masks and other personal protective equipment in the Global South, particularly amongst those women tea pickers who seem to have been left out of the otherwise very strict government guidelines. Yasmin has written about this recently in an article for the Guardian newspaper. How might we as visual sociologists help her to explore and create a set of materials which both speak to the specificity of research and also which could address the difficulty of the digital image itself and the form of representation which is supposed to perform or translate? So this wasn't about illustrating Yasmin's research, but rather beginning a dialogue about how new materials themselves might be generated, which make the issues live and maybe even help us understand of the problem of reaching for those experiences for those who are a very different global situation than our own. This was the precise problem we sought to address. So we decided collectively, a group of researchers, alumni students and current students, that in engaging with Yasmin's research, we wouldn't ask her to break any convention by sharing these original visual images, but rather we'd ask her to provide a short sound recording where she described the image. And then we'd work on this description to make a series of 1-minute films. Yasmin described a scene of women with yellow sacks, waiting, in line, in masks. We knew these were Sri Lankan tea pickers, but everything else we had to imagine from Yasmin's description, and she gave us 4 minutes describing one photo that she'd received. And it was in lockdown and we didn't leave our homes, so we had to use things to hand which could make the translations. So I'm going to share with you now 2 experiments which emerged from these films, and I want to acknowledge the work here of Maxim Gertler-Jaffe, who made the second image. So I'm going to start with a 1-minute silent film where we attempted to make correlations, our lockdown with globally distant sites of representation, things that were circulating, globally distant sites where also images might be ready for intervention and interruption. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. So you'll get a 1-minute film and then we'll come back to me. So the second image I'm going to show is just an image, and it's also about this idea of the gathering of evidence and trying to become more proximate to an image. And this was Maxim's attempt to figure out from Yasmin's description how to make links through ideas of yellow sacks to where the image is analysed and might be intervened on the internet. So he put into Google a series of image searches related to colour, and he started developing a piece of moving image work where he tried to investigate the proximity to images of widely circulated pictures of tea pickers in Sri Lanka in relation to what Yasmin had described. Finally, I want to say that one of the ways we showed these films was actually to demand something particular, and it's actually something that you might be doing right now, which is we asked everyone who came along to bring a cup of tea and to be drinking a cup of tea as they saw the image. And why? Because Yasmin had reminded us that the Jamaican-born British sociologist Stuart Hall said, I mean, what does anyone in the world know about an English person except that they can't get through the day without a cup of tea? Where does it come from? Ceylon, Sri Lanka, India. And Stuart Hall also reminded us in terms of his own personal identity, how different origins come to be embedded in our ideas of what we drink every day. He said, I am the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. I am the sweet tooth, the sugar plantations that rotted generations of English children's teeth. There are thousands of others beside me that are, you know, the cup of tea itself, because they don't grow it in Lancashire, you know. Not a single tea plantation exists for the United Kingdom. And so the sensory translation of the image without the image itself was not only this series of films, but also in a request that our audience, while watching the films, drank a cup of tea. Thanks very much. Aisha asked about spaces that students could use in college, and under normal circumstances there are student bookable spaces, but I have to say, because of lockdown, we've been finding other ways of constructing these ideas of spaces at the moment, and it's quite interesting how those kind of iterate and get developed as space or place as we develop them for visual sociology. So we're starting to kind of explore even more maybe adventurously the normal how and when sound recording constitutes spaces, for example. So even though I don't want to discount the loss that is happening of the spaces that we would normally have student work in and be developed in, there have been some really interesting discussions going on. So yes, and we also are actively developing these other spaces. The Visual Sociology MA programme every year in late March has a public exhibition to finish one of our core practical modules called Social Research for Public Engagement, which kind of does what it says on the tin, that, you know, we try and develop pieces of social research that then are engaged by public rather than just us as peers and teachers. So when you're doing visual sociology, you get to know what your other student interests are, and you can kind of read into things. You might see a piece of film that if one of you just saw it from kind of blank, you might think, oh, it's about X something, and actually it's about something completely different. But we kind of know that you're interested in it, so we look for that interest in there. So our idea of using spaces is actually much more about creating and activating publicness. And we have used the church, but we can create rooms in different kinds of virtual environments that also generate those kinds of active publics to look at work. So the public engagement is what we're developing, much more than necessarily one physical space that provides that affordance. But having said that, yes, we do, under normal circumstances, have spaces that are bookable for students. We do not have studios. We're different from the MFA from that point of view. And in a way, maybe that's what's made the transition, say, for the project that we did on the Yasmin's photo, maybe kind of less jarring than for students who are used to studio-based study, because our students don't have those studios, but they do practice-based work.